My name is Ariel Borujow. We're here at the beautiful Manhattan Beach Recording in New York City. I'm a mix engineer with almost 3 decades of experience, and as of the last 2 years, I've been teaching advanced mixing over at Berklee College of Music. Some of the artists that I've worked with have spanned many different genres. Some of them include Mac Miller, T.I., Madonna, Andrea Bocelli, Supertaste, Walter the producer, and just so many different people. It's been 3 decades, so it's hard to remember them all. My dad's best friend was really big into audio. He was a mechanical engineer, and he built his own speakers that were about 4.5 feet tall. That was my introduction to audio and fidelity. So I remember hearing Paul Simon, Graceland, to the Grateful Dead, to Bob Dylan, to Billy Joel, Led Zeppelin, all of that. And I just became immersed in sound from that moment on. I went to school in 1996 to the Institute of Audio Research, and about 2 weeks into school, I realized that I needed to get an internship. And I looked at credits on a Dave Matthews album, the Crash album, and I saw a studio called Green Street Recording Studios. I called them up. I asked them if they were looking for any students to clean bathrooms, and they hired me on the phone that day. I interned there for the entire duration of school, which was about 9 or 10 months, and I realized early on that sessions weren't happening during the day, so the rooms were always open. They would say to me, if you can clean and make coffee and just make sure everything looks tidy, well, you can go in the room and mess around. So at the time, my friends all had cassettes because they had 4 tracks or 8 tracks. I would bring them into my internship and I would just patch different gear in, and I would learn the gear. And then as I started getting to know the engineers, I realized that what they were doing was creative, and I loved the idea of manipulating frequencies to get a song to sound better. And one of the first engineers I met was a brilliant engineer by the name of John Sickett, who was actually the recording engineer for the Crash album. So it all kind of came full circle. And one of the first sessions I assisted on, because there was no budget and it was just a one-off, was he recorded Fish live concert from Boston, asked me to come in to help him out. And it was all on digital DA-88s because that's how they recorded live concerts. And I got to hang out with him and the keyboard player Paige, and we spent the whole night just mixing. And that was my first introduction. And after that, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Early on in my career, and I still say this, I was a producer's mixer. So when I started and I was working as an assistant at the New York studios, and I worked in many of them, nobody was using computers like that. So everybody was working on MPCs, Tritons, racks of gear. I remember walking in and you'd have to set up keyboards, racks around the producer, and they felt all important. Maybe they didn't use everything, but it looked good. What happened was we were tracking it through preamps, so you'd get to experiment. They didn't care how you did it. You would try to run the kick drum through a Neve. The SSL would handle certain things. So what ended up happening was I worked a lot with producers, and then they would say, hey, just do a quick rough and print it to DAT for me. And I learned how to read their minds, how to be ahead of them and know what they wanted. And I started learning how to mix that way because I needed to get it to sound right for them. And I learned about how to EQ, and I didn't have YouTube or anything, but I would just listen to records and be like, how did they do that? I consider myself a sonic psychiatrist first, then a mixer. In mixing, it's not about you, it's about them. You know, it's a blue-collar job, really. It really is, you know, and it's a client-based business. So it's like, what do you want? What do I need to do to help enhance what you're already doing? What happens nowadays when you jump now to mix engineers, everybody wants to be a mix engineer, and it's a lot of remote, but they don't know how to deal with the client. I remember one of my mentors, who's a fellow professor at Berklee with me, Prince Charles Alexander, taught me years ago when I was assisting him, don't worry about what I'm doing on the console, watch how I work with the client. After the session, I'll answer any questions you have, but observe how I deal with the client. And that was a game changer for me. 2 things. Technology. I love technology. I've been mixing all in the box now for close to 10 years, fully. So for me, the fact that I have a laptop that I can park in my studio, connect it to my speakers and everything, and then take that laptop, and if I want to change my environment and go upstairs, sit on the couch while we're watching Netflix with headphones and continue mixing a record, that to me keeps me excited because I can't imagine what's next. AI has got me really excited in the plugin world. And my students. I learned so much from my students at Berklee. They inspire me even more so now. That's my biggest inspiration. What I try to teach is that mixing is more emotional than it is technical. In the beginning, you're learning the technical side of it and you're learning what to do. The older and more experience you get, you're learning what not to do, and you go more on an emotional level. There's times that if I'm mixing a love song and I have to get my son to school and he wakes up late and I got to get Noah out the door in 45 minutes and he's arguing with me and I'm angry and then I got to go mix, I might not want to mix a love song that day because I'm not emotionally tied to love at that moment. I'm in rage and chaos, dealing with a 10-year-old. That's what people have to understand. Everyone's so worried about frequencies and, these little half a dB here on reverbs and this. No, just use your heart and use your ears, and nobody's listening for that. Does it feel good? The moment the mix feels good, that's it. You're done. I always tell my students, you solo to fix, never to mix. And you should listen to the entire thing because you're not mixing. If you're sitting there like I used to do in my early 20s where you're sitting there EQing a kick drum for, 25 minutes and then you're like, sounds great. And then you put it in the track. Now what starts happening is you have to now fit all the other tracks to that soloed instrument. Half the time you don't even need that. You might not even need to EQ the kick drum. I have a lot of plugins just from my relationships throughout the years, but I'm not using that many. My mixes are very, very simple. What I gravitate towards are companies that are different. Those are the plugins I gravitate towards. I remember when Hans sent me Soothe 2, I was like, what? Just being able to take the edge off some of the digital recordings was such a game changer for me. It's all adaptive in real time, and that is so dope. And now, like the way people are using it, which I've used on this record, I guess it's the technique that I've seen Jason Joshua use where they sidechain the bass or the kick. It gets the frequency out of the way, not actually doing a sidechain compression. So when the bass kicks in, the kick sticks out more and you actually get more low end out of the kick. And it's beautiful because I do a lot of parallel stuff, but I don't really set up parallel chains. I'll just set it to like 30, 40, 50%, maybe sometimes less. Just helps a little bit. And I'm a believer that mixing is small movements to create the big picture. It's not big movements. The first thing I usually do is I will do cleanup on the vocal. And I'll use usually a Pro Q just to do the cleanup and do the cuts. Then I might add the compressor because you always want to clean before, because if you have mud and sort everything before the compressor's going to work harder, right? So I try to get it to work as little as possible because I love dynamics. Then I'll usually use like a channel strip after it, which is usually like an SSL, the G+. After that, I'll put maybe either a de-esser, but if I don't use the de-esser because it takes out too much, then I'll use the Soothe because I use the SSL to tone shape and bring back what's missing. Bloom sits on my master bus. The day that I received Bloom from Hannes, it has lived on every mix for the last year and a half. The way that I always viewed my mixing is I always dreamt in my head of creating some sort of console, call it the Ariel Borujow console on the master. And it's a combination of compression, saturation, bloom, clipping. I set that up, and from the beginning, the moment I get my balance with the rough mix of the client, as soon as I turn it on, it's already like destroys the rough. It really does. But bloom makes a big deal, and I use it anywhere between 50 to 75% on the wet dry. Never full, but when you hear the difference and you bypass, the mix collapses because I'm heavily dependent on it from the beginning. And it makes me do less individually as well. I use it in mid-side mode most of the time. That, to me, is awesome. The other thing that's really cool is how you could change it from normal to high quality. And there's a big difference between the two sounds. For the mix bus, I always have it on high quality. Bloom for me is at the top of the food chain as far as plugins, and I mean that. It's on every single mix. I can't tell you how many students of mine went out and purchased it when they saw it on my, and I always tell them, like, first understand balance and all that, but right away they'll, email me and say, this plugin is so cool, it makes things sound better. And I'm like, yes, understand what it's doing so you can understand how hard you can push. But to me, there's nothing on the market like that, particularly the way that I use it, how stable it is. And the fact that you can do it in mid-side mode is just a game changer for me, because mid-side mode could give a sound more width if you use it correctly, which is why mastering engineers were using that before we were. I actually used it on this record on the strings, because sometimes there's these resonant peaks, and once I start going into EQ them, I feel like I lose something out of them. Then I feel like I have to chase my tail. So for instance, I'll like dip out those resonant peaks, and then I use, for instance, like an LA2A from UAD, because there's a warmth on the gray model of that I like, and I couldn't figure it out. And on this mix, I ended up putting it on the strings. There was a string setting on there that I had to tweak, but once I put it on there, I was like, oh my God, there it is. Because of the adaptive tone shaping it was doing, and it was picking up already the resonant peaks that was dipping it down. So the song that I'm going to be breaking down is a song called Chemistry by a group named Supertaste. It's featuring a very talented artist from Montreal, Canada, named Dariana Everett. You could check her music out as well. The song was produced by Supertaste and written by Dariana and Supertaste. One of the things that I find important is the fact that you as a mixer are spending maybe 8 to 10 hours on a song. However, the artist might be spending anywhere between a month to a year on the same song. So what I like to think when I'm mixing is I take their rough mix into consideration always. Listen to it, feel what the intention of the rough is, and enhance what's there. Let's now take a look at how I'm using Bloom to help tone shape and clean up some of the resonant peaks on the overall mix. So let me explain it and let me play it with and without the Bloom. So you can obviously hear that there's a difference in width, there's a difference in low end, there's a difference in the high end. It's pretty much all across the board. And let me break down some of these bands because I'm not using all of the bands here. So let's start with the mid. What I was trying to achieve with the mid was because in the middle of the mix is where the low end is. And I wanted to make sure that I started with that because I always have looked at plugins, especially on the master, how can they recreate the sounds of the consoles that I was so used to? So I wanted a little bit of low end without me having to push individual instruments, thinking about the Neve console. So let's take a listen. So you can clearly hear what's happening in the low frequencies here, and I'm boosting around 90 hertz here in the mid mode, which is in the center. Here, I'm taking out a little bit in the low mids, a little bit of 480 for the boxiness, and this is what you're hearing. And then you notice I don't have the high mids engaged, but I have the highs engaged. And this was to bring a little bit of air to Dariana's vocals. So this is what you hear. And we're boosting around 10.1K there. But now the interesting thing is if we get to the sides here, I'm doing a little bit in the lows as well, but only 2 dB at 90 hertz. And I know a lot of people like to dip out the low end on the sides, but for me, there's information there that I really want to enhance. And sometimes if you have your mixed balance correctly and you do have some lows in the sides that are enhanced, it could give the mix a wider feel, because low frequencies, when they're widened, tend to sound wider than the high-end frequencies. And I'm doing the same thing in the low mids at 500 hertz here. Nothing again in the high mids, and in the highs, just because there's the hi-hats and other elements that are happening in the high end, when the chorus kicks in, everything just comes in a little bit brighter, which I want to add that high-end excitement on the side. So this is what you're hearing at about 10.1. So again, let me play it with and without, now that you understand exactly what I was trying to achieve with this. And again, what I'm trying to do here is, the reason that I have a slower attack and faster release, I like to keep as much of the dynamics and transients as possible, particularly in a song that's really drum heavy, which this song is. And I want to make sure that I'm not crushing a lot of these dynamics, especially with heavy attacks. I just want this to really just touch up on the mix. And again, the reason that you hear such a difference is, before touching any plugins, I match it to the rough mix. Then I add this, and you can hear the difference when I add my master bus compression, my saturation bloom, and I'm also using an EQ and a clipper on there. You can hear the difference when I bypass all of these. Take a listen. I'm actually using it on high quality, which makes a huge difference. If you have the computer power, which at this point, technology's so far from where we were that it should be fine if you're not overusing other plugins as well that eat up a lot of CPU. One of the reasons you're hearing such a big difference is because from the beginning, I'm mixing into these plugins, which is giving me a sound within itself. If you add the plugins later on in the mix and you've spent time tweaking it halfway through, then add the plugins, you're not going to hear such a drastic change, because you haven't been mixing into the plugins early on in the mix, and I'm doing it right from the beginning. So that is a big part of my sound personally for the last year and change. One of the ways that I'm using Bloom is the strings in this song. I felt there was a couple resonant peaks in here, and there's a great preset on here that I used, which I ended up tweaking as well, but it's also on mid-side mode, and it's for the strings, so it's a string ensemble, and let's play it with and without. So here's without, and I'll solo the strings so you can hear them. You can hear the subtleties of it softening up some of those resonant peaks, particularly in the low mids. Let me solo the low mids for you guys so you can hear. And you can hear that resonant peak there in the low mids. That's around 170. And I'm also getting a little bit more of the lows here. Softening up a little bit of the high mids. And not doing anything on the highs really. And then that's on the mids. Let's take a look at the highs, what I'm doing. Pretty much similar. Here's what you're hearing on the low mids at 175 on the sides. Getting a little bit less on the lows on the sides here. High mids. And the highs. So when you put it all together, here's without again. So what you can hear is it's actually making me do less. I don't feel like I have to go in and fix any of this. And I'm also taking into consideration that not having to do so much additional EQing to this. I mean, I used a little bit of EQ where I dumbed down around the 374 hertz, which is this. And the Bloom pretty much not only took care of the resonant peaks there, but it also helped me tone shape the sound, which was really important for me. And when you play it all together, especially in the chorus, this is what you got. And I'll take the Bloom off here for you guys to hear. You can actually hear how much darker it feels in that section. Watch when I play it again with the Bloom in. So if you look closely at the graph here, you can see that in the lows and low mids, you can see the peak here that it's grabbing, and it really helps settle the strings much better into the mix, which is why I love this plugin so much. And I'm using this one at 100%. It really needed it. One of the things that I love to do, particularly when you have cymbals, sometimes shakers, they tend to be a little bit too bright at times. And although sometimes bright is good, it's also nice to sort of dampen some of those high-end frequencies. So in here, I'm using the Soothe just to take some of the edge off of these hi-hats. So let's listen without. And with the Soothe in. So I'm really using here, this band here, and if I solo it, it's around the 5K. And most importantly, band 4, we're up at the 12K, which is really, really that top end that I'm grabbing. It almost hurts your ears. So just softening it up a little bit, and it's not doing much, maybe a dB to 2 dB of dampening of those frequencies. And I'm using it in normal mode. It is just a background element, but still important in the chorus to add the excitement that I want to hear. So here's in the mix, with and without. So you can hear it helps settle it a little bit in the mix. And that's sort of how I try to tame some of those high-end elements. Okay, let's take a look at how I'm using Soothe to duck the low-mid frequencies of the bass so the kick can cut through more. What we're doing is we're keying off of the kick drum. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to get the kick to poke out a little bit, particularly in the chorus. So let's hear it without the Soothe and the Sidechaining. This is what the chorus sounded like. And now let's hear it with, and you'll hear the difference. Now let's take it and solo it so you can hear what exactly it's doing. Here's without. And what you're hearing is when the kick comes in, what you're doing is you're taking those frequencies that are in the way of the kick and sort of ducking them down a little bit, just the frequencies. This changed my perspective because I used to do a lot of sidechaining with the kick and bass, and you can really hear that this is a much different approach to it and actually gets the kick to punch more without losing too much of the bass. And it's just basically frequency dependent. So let's take a listen again. If you listen carefully, you can hear those low and low mid frequencies of the bass jump up when I put the Soothe and bypass. And what that allows to do is when two low-end frequency instruments like the bass and the kick are playing at the same time, they're naturally going to share similar frequencies. So just getting those frequencies out of the way just even a little bit allows the kick to sort of poke out a little bit and drive the chorus more. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I want to thank oeksound for making some of the dopest, most unique plugins. And also to Supertaste, my brothers, and Dariana Everett for this wonderful song. And hopefully it'll be out soon so you can all hear it out on streaming platforms. Peace.